Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Lioness Origin Story podcast. My name is Shaun. I'm a director of programming with the Veterans Breakfast Club. Our mission is to create communities of listening around veterans and their stories to connect, educate, heal, and inspire. You can find out everything there is to know about the Veterans Breakfast Club on our website, www.veteransbreakfastclub.org. Welcome to VBC's third episode of Lioness, the Origin Story. This is a special 8-part podcast where Lioness vets and those who know the history of the Lioness program discuss Taylor Sheridan's new show, Special Ops Lioness, through the lens of their experience. Joining me again are filmmaker and writer Daria Summers and Army veteran Shannon Morgan, who's also an original Lioness. And we also have a special guest, which we'll get to in just a minute. In 2008, filmmaker and writer Daria Summers, along with her filmmaking colleague Meg McLagan, released Lioness, a feature-length documentary that revealed the history of a group of women support soldiers who went to Iraq in 2003 as mechanics, clerks, and engineers, but ended up serving as the original Lioness soldiers. Although the Lioness's mission was to defuse tensions with Iraqi women and children, they fought in some of the bloodiest battles of the Iraq War. Shannon Morgan was a member of that original group of Lioness soldiers, an Army mechanic from Mena, Arkansas. She served in Ramadi from 2003 to 2004. During the 2004 battle for Ramadi, she was one of the group of Army Lioness soldiers attached to the 2-4 Marines during house-to-house searches. That put her at the center of some of the fiercest street fighting of the war. I'm happy and very honored to be a part of this conversation today, and I'm going to hand it off here to Daria for episode 3 of our Lioness Origin Story podcast. How are you doing, Daria?
I'm doing great, Shaun, and thank you so much for the introductions. Hi, Shannon. Here we are on week 3 of our podcast already. Before we check in on the most recent episode of Special Ops Lioness, we have a special guest who's going to be able to clarify what so much of the press about on the TV show has either left out or gotten wrong, and that is the actual origin, the genesis of Team Lioness. And that special guest is retired U.S. Army Colonel David Brinkley, whose career in service earned him a Bronze Star, a Meritorious Service Medal, and an Army Commendation Medal, among others. In 2003, he was the battalion commander of the 1st Engineer Battalion of the 1st Infantry Division in Ramadi, Iraq. Not only did my co-host Shannon Morgan serve under him, Colonel Brinkley is the one person who can tell us about the genesis of Team Lioness because he, along with U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Richard Cabry, came up with the idea. They were, as they say in the Hamilton music, in the room where it happened. So, hi, Dave. Welcome. And since I know your time is limited, let's just dive in. Please tell us the story of the genesis of Team Lioness. How did it come about?
Yeah, hey, and good morning, team. It's good to be here with you. And Daria, it was good to catch up with you yesterday, and it's good to talk with Shannon because normally we banter back and forth on Facebook. So, and Shaun, thanks for hosting. I appreciate the invite. Yeah, so a little bit of background. I was very fortunate and honored to command an Army combat engineer, and the structure of the Army at the time was you had a combat engineer at every, what we would call a maneuver brigade combat team. So it's, if you will, it's like the fighting organization of the Army. What typically happens in combat is one of the missions of a combat engineer battalion, besides all the engineer battalion stuff, is to fight as infantry when required. And it's the only branch that actually has that caveat in its sort of basic mission set. So, we are trained to fight as infantry, and we are equipped to fight as infantry, and we very frequently are used in that role. And to be frank, even in our combat engineer mission, a lot of times to an outside observer, it's hard to understand if are those infantry or are they engineers. So, and so I wanted to caveat that up front because at the time period, we were in a flux in how the Army organized itself. So 3 of my 4 companies were male only. So they were strictly the what we would call the line companies, the, A, B, and C companies. They were 100% male. My headquarters company, where Shannon served, was open to women at the time, and it kind of created a challenge in reference to the Combat Exclusion Policy, because as an example, those male-only companies, they are supported from the headquarters with things like mechanics and medics and signal people and, chemical decon people and et cetera, which in many cases, just because of how things are assigned, were women. So we're constantly kind of in a little bit of an interesting situation where you had a male-only unit with a lot of augmentation from soldiers that were women. So kind of where the genesis of the whole Lioness thing came is, as we were being used in, I would call, our infantry role, we would go out frequently to do search and attack missions, aimed primarily at disrupting the insurgents' logistics train. So frankly, we're looking for those weapons caches, trying to get the ammunition, the artillery shells, the mines, and et cetera, off the street before they could be used in IEDs or shot at us or whatever. So that required us to spend a lot of time searching, the local villages in town, and et cetera. Because of how we augmented our line companies with support from the headquarters, it was pretty typical to have a platoon out on a mission, and where they started was they would have, most of the medics would be women. And so when we went into the villages, I started to notice a phenomenon where whether it was at a checkpoint operation or we're actually searching, a village or a neighborhood, when the local populace realized there was a woman there, it significantly lowered the tension of the situation. And again, you can put yourself in the inhabitants' kind of mindset for a minute. All of a sudden, a bunch of heavily armed, big people with body armor and helmets and weapons festooned everywhere just come busting through your front door. That creates tension. I mean, just put yourself in the reverse of that if somebody came through your front door like that. And given the culture of the Iraqis, they're very protective of their women and their children, and particularly with, men that aren't in the family. So you can just put yourself in that, searching people, making sure there's no weapons. It creates a lot of issues. So, but we noticed when we had a woman there, just usually a medic initially, that would de-stress. And so then whichever, woman soldier was there, they could go through the segregation of the genders, if you will, and things just would calm down. Because the Iraqi men did not have a problem with an American soldier alone with their women and children if it was a woman. They would get great consternation if it was a male. The other thing we noticed is that once we kind of got everybody separated and we're going through our operations, the women would tell our women all kinds of things that were good intel. Because frankly, from their perspective, they didn't want those weapons stored in their village, and they really did not want their sons, husbands, etc., brothers going out and fighting with us, because that usually was a losing proposition for them. Just the nature of how we're armed and etc. So they would tell us, what I would call actionable intelligence. It was very useful. And so I was pondering this because, we're in a little different reality now in Iraq, because we kind of went in ready to do army on army fighting. And there wasn't much of that by the time we got there at the sort of the back end of OIF-1. It was more of contested peacekeeping, which really turned into an insurgency because, we went there with one mission. It kind of evolved into another one. And so as we're working with the populace, and I'll say up front, things that we know now that we didn't know then, when we went into Iraq in OIF-1, I, for one, and I don't think most of the Army understood tribal network and how powerful the tribal structure was of Iraq. And nor did we have training on how to do civil military operations or deal with the population. I mean, we didn't even have interpreters initially. So, and then when we finally got interpreters, we really didn't have near enough to do the kind of missions we were expected. But we did notice this phenomena of that having women embedded with the combat organizations created opportunities for us to get weapons off the street, to get a better idea who the people we really wanted to target were, and to de-escalate things. So I was thinking about this one day, and Mike Cabry, who, for the record, also retired as a colonel, and I know his official thing is Richard Cabry, but he goes by Mike. Anyway, Mike and I are really old friends. We were old friends from multiple assignments before. We were both very happy to be stationed together as commanders. And so we were kind of confidants in each other when we could kind of sit down and say, I don't really understand why this is happening. What do you think? Or here's what I'm seeing. What do you think? And we were having one of those sessions one night, just two of us, kind of late evening chow or whatever, kind of that fourth meal they serve to the people that have to work overnight, having a conversation about this phenomena that I'd seen about, how, the women being there was creating opportunities. And then Mike's battalion, he had no women at all. He was 100% male. And we got talking about it. He goes, I would like to capitalize on that same opportunity in my area of operation, which was a nasty little town that is Tameen, which was, if you will, a suburb of Ramadi, if there is such a thing. And so, okay, well, how are we going to make that work? And, because I started to put more women out, kind of in this engagement role than just with the normal support structure of the medics. So, we had started to experiment with that a little bit. And I had a conversation with Kate Pendry, who was she's now Kate Tormenson, but she was the HHC, the headquarters commander, about, hey, what do you think about this? And how do we make sure that, these young women that we're sending out that were not trained for any of this, they're trained to be mechanics or chemical specialists or medics or whatever, because I was also aware that, well, they have a day job. If they're mechanics, they need to be working on, repairing vehicles. If they're signaleers, they need to make sure we can talk. And if they're medics, they're supposed to be doing medical stuff. So when you pull them to do something else, kind of like we were pulled to fight as infantry, well, then so there's a risk there, and there's a balance in that. Where do they need to be today? And I also wanted to make sure that who we were sending out on these things were, mature enough, trained enough, confident enough that they could do this weird mission, this new mission, and this evolving mission as safely as we could make it. So we started to experiment. So anyway, Mike was in I would like to, I would like to have that opportunity, but I don't have women. So, how do we ask you to support me with your soldiers? And, we kind of were, not joking around, but kind of, a little humor, like, well, how are you going to ask for that? Because you can't go to the brigade operations to say, hey, tell first engineers to give me some girls. That's just not, not going to go over well. And then I said, well, I'm not going to ever send one. I'm always going to send at least two, maybe more, depending on the mission and the requirements. So we started banding around, well, what do we call this organization? What do we ask? What do I ask for? So then everybody knows what that means. And we batted around a bunch of names, and probably on our third or fourth cup of coffee, we came up with Lioness, because at least in our minds, I can go ask for a Lioness team to support me from the Engineer Battalion. no different than I would go to the artillery battalion and say, I need you to support me with a fire support team. Or I need to go to the support battalion and ask for an additional forward support maintenance team. So we came up with Lioness because we thought it defines that, this is an all-women organization, hence why it wasn't called the Lion Team. That it kind of gave the right, feel, because lionesses are very protective. They're very fierce, particularly in what they do, and the pride. And it just seemed like it worked. And so that's what we did. We came up with the Team Lioness thing, probably, somewhere between 11 and midnight one night, and it worked. And it took off. So then when we said Lioness and the brigade, and then ultimately when the 1st Marine Division came in with the Marines, they kind of knew what that was. And so that's how we organized for combat in this regard. And then, it just sort of became a thing. I had an in-bed reporter from the Seattle Intelligencer, if memory serves me. And she got very interested in this. And did some reporting. She was my in-bed reporter, if you will, while we were fighting. And so anyway, and then it took off. And really, from my perspective as the commander, these young ladies just did phenomenal work in a very dangerous and volatile environment. They just did great work, and I'm very fortunate that none of them got hurt doing it, and because there was a high potential for that, and they just really did a great job. And I'm very proud of all of them, and I'm still proud of them to this day. But that is where the term Team Lioness came from. 2 tired lieutenant colonels drinking way too much coffee too late at night after a long day of missions, trying to kind of figure out what we were going to do with this new capability.
That's great. I want my follow-up question to that, in a kind of a larger view. That was a boots on the ground decision you needed to make from your perspective to accomplish the mission. But it, from a sort of a larger perspective, at what point during that did you think, well, there's a disconnect? In other words, there's the Combat Exclusion Policy for women. And at what point did you think, well, we might be violating it, we might not, or did it not matter to you or occur to you?
Oh, it occurred. I mean, I'd gone through this in a previous assignment. So the assignment before I came to the 1st Engineers as commanders, I was the executive officer of the 20th Engineer Battalion at what was then Fort Hood. It's now known as Fort Cavasas, in the 1st Cavalry Division. And then I went on to be the Brigade S3 before I came to Fort Riley. And when I was in the 20th Engineers as a major, was the first time I had ever served with women in the unit I was in, because the rest of my career, was all combat engineer, male only. No, there were no women in the organization. And that changed from the time I was a company commander in the late 80s to when I was back in a unit in the in the late 90s. That changed, over that time when I was doing other things in the Army. So, a short, war story. We had a young lieutenant in that battalion who was a superstar. I think she was probably one of the best lieutenants in the battalion, and she should have been, if I'm looking at career development of future engineer company commanders, majors, battalion commanders, she should have had one of the line platoons, the fighting platoons. But because of this combat exclusion thing, she had to stay in headquarters company and got to lead the support platoon, which was kind of a teeny little platoon. And it's a valid requirement, and you need a support platoon, but it just seemed to me to be a problem. And so I asked, why can't we're in peacetime, we're in garrison, nothing's going on. Why can't we give her a platoon and a company that's going to better prepare her to be a company commander in a couple of years? And everybody lost their minds. You're going to go to jail. The world's coming to an end. Dogs are sleeping with cats. All that kind of, dystopian future. And so I was basically told no. I was told no by my battalion commander. I was told no by the brigade commander, and I was told to shut up and color. So I did. Okay, but I still got that in the back of my mind, because my view is, okay, I didn't come up with this cockamamie organization, but it's the one I got to live with. Because I'm kind of if you're capable and qualified, then you should be able to do the job. I don't really care what your background is, what you look like, or what your gender is. If you can do the job, you ought to have the opportunity to do the job. That's just me. And I think it comes from always being in units that are undermanned and, not exactly missions as they should have been or whatever. But, Medica's just been growing up basically with a single mother who's trying to raise 4 boys. So, so bottom line is, so now I'm in an opportunity where I can make the decisions. And so, as I said in the documentary that you made, I was given a set of tools to do the mission, and some of that was equipment, some of it was weapons. It was mostly people. Some of those people were women. Most of those people were male or men. And so, but that's what I got to deal with. And so I didn't think I had the luxury to go, I'll give you a perfect example. I didn't have the luxury to say, I can't send the medics out with you, combat engineer platoon, 100% male, because they're women, because they need the medical support. Now, technically, the women shouldn't have been out with them. But then I go back to, well, then the women are assigned to the headquarters, which is where the medical platoon is. Why do I have a medical platoon? Is to provide medical support to my units that are out fighting. So to me, it would have been incorrigible to not put the women out there to do the job they're trained to do simply because they're women. And that's kind of where, in my view, the combat exclusion policy breaks down. Now, it was the law, and it was the policy of the Department of Defense. And so just to be straight up on the record now that I think I'm past the point where I can be recalled to active duty for punishment purposes. Yeah, I knew I was violating. I mean, just to be honest, I knew I was violating the law, but I also knew that I was set up to do that by my own organizational structure. And it's no different than, if I had to send a mechanic team out to work on the equipment of that company where it was out in the field, that would have been mostly women. Because that's who I have to do that mission. So, and from them just doing their day jobs out there, we saw sort of how this worked. But yeah, I knew I was potentially on thin ice. I actually started putting women in kind of men's jobs when we were still at Fort Riley. Because my brigade commander said he was okay with it as long as we were in garrison. And so I went, okay, and I just ran with it. And then, when we got into combat, no one noticed. And if they did notice, they didn't really say much about it. I mean, I ended up putting a young officer in a platoon because I was just out of men, and she was very sharp, very confident. She was probably one of the first combat engineer platoon leaders that was a woman in a divisional combat engineer battalion. I don't know that for sure, but she did phenomenal. And, I guess I got away with it. And not long after that, I mean, things started to change because, I did remember I was on a mission one day, and General Mattis, who at the time was the 1st Marine Division commander, called me on the radio and told me to meet him in the road. So I kind of went out there with some trepidation because usually when General Mattis told you to meet him in the road, he was going to fire you. So I was kind of thinking, did he fire me since I'm in the Army or not? I don't know. But I went out there, and he was kind of drilling me on whether I had women forward of the regimental rear boundary. And so I was scratching my head, trying to, I didn't want to answer him and be, snide or sarcastic because, he's a two-star and I'm a lieutenant colonel. But I told him, no, sir, I don't have any women any place they're not supposed to be, because I couldn't define where the regimental rear boundary was to begin with, since we were surrounded basically in Ramadi. And we were having this conversation, it really struck. I don't think he noticed it, but one of my armored vehicles drove by. It was actually my armored personnel carrier that I had lent to my headquarters company commander for the mission. And so Kate Pendry came by in kind of my hatch with all of her glorious red hair kind of flowing out the back of the combat vehicle helmet. While we were having this conversation about women forward of the regimental rear boundary, here comes a captain who happens to be a woman in an armored personnel carrier driving right by on the mission. So, so again, I think I answered him as honestly as possible, since I didn't know where the regimental rear boundary was. It certainly couldn't be the Kuwait-Iraqi border, because there were all kind of women forward of that. And I really don't, again, since we're surrounded in Ramadi, I don't really, I couldn't define where that might be. So I just went on a limb and said, I didn't say yes or no. I just said, I don't have women anywhere they're not authorized to be. And then he was okay, and he went his way and I went my way. And this all came back, all of this came back when I was kind of put in charge of gender integrating combat arms for the Army, later in life, after I'd retired and gone to work as a Department of the Army civilian. Some of the silly conversations we had about all of that, going all the way back to she's really competent and she's probably the number one officer, but you can't put her there because of nothing she did. I mean, she's gone to all the training, she's done all the certification, she's 100% as good to do that job as any of the boys, but just because she's a girl, you can't. It just never made sense to me. And fortunately, now we're in a world where nobody has to make those hard decisions anymore, because everything is open and women can serve wherever they choose, as long as they can meet the standards to serve in that MOS or that unit. And that we've been doing that for going on 10 years now, and the Army seems to be doing okay.
I'll respond to a couple things you said there. First, I can't imagine a better comedic moment in a movie where you're talking to Mattis and on drives by the flowing red hair. That's hysterical.
Yeah.
But it speaks to your leadership and the insight you have to recognize talent, and I applaud you for wanting to promote talent and skill and allowing that to flourish. I think as a civilian myself, I think one of the things that we kind of hear that I'd love to debunk here is, can you speak to the effectiveness of the Lionesses? We don't quite know, in a male sort of dominated field like the military, when women are given more responsibility, we hear a bit about, is this effective? And since you had a sort of a frontline view on this, can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think it was. I mean, I'll be straight up. It kind of depended on how effective they were, depended on who they were attached to, and I'll explain how that was. So I think they were very effective supporting my operations, but, then they were already my soldiers. So I like to think they were kind of inculcated into how we did business in the Die Hard Battalion. I think when they were with 1st Battalion's 5th Artillery, Cabry's unit, they did very well there too. They probably would be assessed as less effective when they were with 2-4 Marines, because frankly, the Marines took a dim view on the whole thing to begin with and actively did everything they could not to support it. And our infantry battalion kind of had, our 116 infantry had a little bit of a mixed effectiveness. And I think it boils down to the leaders and kind of how they see this as an opportunity. and then how they used that opportunity. I found it very effective, and I think, Mike Cabry would agree with me. I found it super effective to kind of get into the headspace of the local population to get actionable intel. And every time we had something we could act on, that made our mission safer. Because I think we did a credible job of severely damaging the enemy's ability to get weapons and ammunition into the theater to shoot us with or blow us up. And why? Because we went after that, where they would hide it. And then what gave us a lot of insights on where they would hide it and what was there and who was the bad guys were the Lionesses talking with the women of wherever we were, because they had it was almost like a natural bond of womanhood, and those Iraqi women would tell my women soldiers things that they would never tell anybody else. And then you would go, hey, they would be like, hey, you might want to go look over in that hay bale. And look, there's like 15 mines in there, which we would not have found probably otherwise. And so that means that now those things aren't going to be laid, and we're not going to drive over them and blow up. And so, I saw a similar kind of effect in the Balkans when I was stationed there, whereas the women would just get tired of all the silliness, and they would roll out shopping carts full of weapons and ammunition and just sort of place it in the street when a NATO patrol would come by, because they were just tired of it being, in their basement, or worried about their men folk being found with this stuff they're not supposed to have. And I kind of saw a similar thing in Iraq, where they're not village elders, but I would call them village matrons. They just don't want that stuff in their they just don't want it around them, and they don't want their children to be exposed to it, and they don't want their again, like I said, they don't want their sons, husbands, and brothers out there using it and then, coming back dead. And I think we were able to capitalize on that human factor a little bit as we better understood the psyche of the local population, and which we really weren't trained for. We kind of had to bumble into it. We didn't have civil affairs support. We didn't have, any of that. We were just trying to figure it out on the fly. And the Lionesses are a good example of where we figured it out on the fly. And I think it had I think it was the genesis of a big effect, because not long after that, you got, female engagement teams springing up everywhere. You've got special forces teams that are specifically asking for female augmentation to their team structure for the same reasons. So you saw a huge growth in women in civil affairs. And I think that all speaks to how effective this original origin story was, in my opinion, but it's just my opinion.
I just want to say, Dave, it's so wonderful to speak to you now. I know when we originally interviewed you, you were still in the military, and there are probably parameters about what you could and could not say. So hearing the General Mattis story is wonderful. And going into the specifics on the origin story in this way is really important, I think, to get all that information out now. And I wanted to follow up, well, I really appreciate it. And I wanted to follow up with the question of, because now, in so much of the press, and a lot of it is Marine websites talking about how, Team Lioness, sort of basically was their idea. I want to get back to what was the attitude. Maybe you could detail a little bit more of that, the resistance when sort of the 2-4 Marines arrived in town. But they were resistant, but at the same time, the Lioness teams did go out with them. So it was like, are you saying they knew they had to include them, but they didn't really want to?
Just haven't done the gender integration work with the Marines. They were 100% against it. They did everything they could to prevent women going into combat arms. And I just, and particularly in their infantry formation. So you got that. And to be honest, our Army infantry organizations were the same way when we started gender integration. And that's why I go back to I don't know that 116 infantry for the United States Army is effective using the Lionesses either.
Well, I can confirm, Shaun and Dave, that the History Channel documentary that was in our documentary, because there was only one and that was it, and it was really only a focus on the Marines, and the Team Lioness not mentioned at all, which was disturbing, and it brings it back to this point. One of the reasons why we're doing this podcast is because, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, is that, just being in touch with the Lionesses, and Shannon, you can speak to this. They're, with Taylor Sheridan's TV show, Special Ops Lioness, there's some disturbance in terms of using that name for a show that just doesn't really represent. I mean, there's a long history and a proud history behind that name that's fairly recent, and the women who served are still, around, and they went through a lot, and so there's kind of a feeling of like, why are you using that name? And I was just like wondering if you could speak to like how you see that.
Well, when I first heard about it coming up, I was like, oh, cool. But they're finally going to get their due. You know what I mean? All things being equal, knowing that Hollywood's probably going to have a little bit of a warped perspective on it. And then to find out it was CIA, I was like, well, maybe they adopted the program as well. Real world. I don't know if they did or didn't. It wouldn't surprise me if they did. But I've not watched the show, frankly, and so I really can't talk to how it looks on screen. It's a little disappointing because I think, I really think, the nation needs to know what these soldiers did and how well they did it. But, part of me says that, there's a documentary coming out on the 761st Tank Battalion, which was an all-black unit in World War II that fought with distinction in Europe. No one heard of them until just lately, and that's been 70 years. So, it's kind of like the Tuskegee Airmen, until somebody took the time to say, hey, I know this was unpopular at the time because we had all these prejudices or whatever, but look how well they did. And now we're just learning about it. So, my view is, okay, it's been 20 years, so maybe we're starting to learn about it. Maybe there's an opportunity to kind of set the record straight and say, here's what really happened. Because I know the Marines did adopt this later, and they went through a whole training thing, and they built their own teams of women Marines. And so I think in the end, the Marines probably got it as well to the point where it was working as well as it did with the Army, to me, I would like to get the origin story out there so people know, these young ladies had a difficult mission. They fought with distinction. They did the nation proud with their service. And, it shouldn't be a afterthought of history.
Right.
That's
I agree. And I mean, I also think that, and maybe because I was in the film, and we were documenting as much as we could of this origin story. I do have just the perspective of when we took the film up to Capitol Hill, and people watched it. And Shannon, you remember, you were up, or you spoke. You told your story along with Rainey and Stacy Breslow about your experiences, and Rebecca Nava, and it was a catalyst for change, and many other things. I think just the experiences of women in this particular conflict, all contributed, but the Lioness story played a big role and ended up in some of the testimony to help change things. So it did change history in a way.
Oh, I definitely think it did change history. I think it's important to start with what Colonel Brinkley said. He didn't see a gender discretion. He seen us as soldiers. And if it was needed for a soldier to fit the bill for that job, he didn't care. And he believed in us. And we're here today because of him, period. Him and Colonel Cabry for giving us that opportunity. And then we just carried the fight on to DC, where we wanted to enact policy change to back it up. And all of that was successful. And it's because we had leadership that believed in us, period.
So I just want to end this by saying that of all the women that I've spoken to who served under you, Dave, when you were Colonel Brinkley of the 1st Engineer Battalion, everyone has just said your leadership made all the difference, and that they felt safe, they felt acknowledged, respected because of your leadership. And of all the different, I've talked to leaders and colonels and in the Marines, and I've never heard anyone spoken with by women with as much respect as you. So I just thought you're probably getting uncomfortable with the compliment, but I'm giving it to you anyway. It's really impressive.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, I'm here smiling because, I as I see it, I was just doing my job. And to be honest with you, Shannon had it right. These are soldiers I had, and my little understrength engineer battalion to get after a pretty large mission. And some of those soldiers were women, and those women were, Shannon's a good example. She was a premier mechanic. And she was also, I will say, the best shot in the entire battalion. Those 12 Bravos who were like all combat arms and this is what we do, she could shoot, circles around, which frankly made them uncomfortable in a good way. But so then you go through, okay, Soldier Shannon, what do we do with Specialist Morgan today? Do I need her most repairing a vehicle? Do we need her on the supply run to Baghdad because we need her skills on the machine gun? Or do I need her out all night with whomever on a Lioness mission? And it's just the calculus that goes into, it's the kind of the array of forces of, here's the missions I have today. What's the best way to get after them with the least risk? And that kind of depends. That's where the soldiers go. So, and she did very well at all of that. And and so that's like 3 full-time jobs and 1 full-time day. So, and I could say that about all of them. And Stacy Breslow was in communications. So if she was doing Lioness, then somebody else was covering her in communications. And I could go on and on. I kind of gave Kate Pendry about 3 companies worth of work with 1 company headquarters to do. And again, they all did magnificent, but and so did my other folks. And Did I have some problem soldiers? Yeah, everybody does. And so, okay, but how do you deal with that? What do you do? How do you make it better? How do you take care of your people? To me, that just kind of goes with the green tabs that you get to wear on your uniform as a commander. So I appreciate the compliment, but you know, I kind of humbly just will tell you I was just trying to do my job as best as I could with the folks that I had, and I was blessed with some really, really good folks.
Well, I am so appreciative that we were able to get you to join us today and really drill down on the origin story here, because I think it's important to put out, and I think that especially as this show, the Special Ops Lioness show is now is being shown on Paramount Plus. Just to add, and while we are supportive of women in Hollywood and roles and action roles, in whatever roles they want to do, we just want to counter it with the actual history to make sure that the Team Lioness, the incarnations of them in the Army as they evolved into the Marines, the FETs, and whatever backdoor missions there were with the CIA, if there were any, they're probably not ones we're going to hear about. I mean, we just want to get that history right, and you're a big part of that. I would say you're the beginning of it, and so you can't really tell the history without talking to Colonel David Brinkley. So thank you so very much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
No, it's my pleasure. I mean, the real hero is your counterpart, you know, Shannon Morgan. So, and her fellow Lionesses, they're the heroes of all this. I'm just sort of a old bystander.
Well, okay. All together, all of you, I'm just helping to get all the voices out. And so you're right about Shannon, though. She's like amazing, and I've known her now for so many years, but and she continues to impress me, especially with her nonprofit, Operation Lioness. So thank you very much.
Okay, it was good talking with you guys too. So have a great one.
And to our listeners, thank you for listening to the podcast. As we sort of move into the episode of Special Ops Lioness, episode 3, we're going to continue this conversation with Daria and Shannon. But before we get to the episode, Shannon, you know, we just heard some incredible history by Colonel Brinkley, and I just wanted to give you some time here to sort of respond to, you know, his ideas, the things that he was talking about, your involvement in it. I'd love to hear your angle.
Everything he said was so nice. I mean, it just speaks to his character as a leader and as a human being in general. It's just so important, you know, in military or civilian life. Your leadership is crucial. If your leadership doesn't believe in you, then your mission's going to fail before it even starts. Colonel Brinkley was an amazing commander, and like I said, basically it came down to he was given orders that he needed to fulfill, and it didn't matter to him whether you were a male or a female. If you could do the job, that's what fell on your shoulders, not your gender identity in that situation.
And a sort of follow-up question to that is, he talked about what he saw was the women were getting actionable intel when they would talk with other women in in these tribes. And I certainly, you know, listening to this, it's probably one of the most amazing things we have in common culturally, is that I think the women in these tribes were like, we don't want our men and our children to be in danger. Please get this stuff out of here. And I just thought I would ask you, was this what you saw as a part of the unit when you would go outside the wire?
Absolutely. The women, you know, women just, I think in general, tend to be a little more keen on things sometimes, and they realized very quickly if they covered for the males, for their husbands or sons or brothers or whoever it might be, they realized that they put everybody in a situation, and it also put them in a situation, but when we were able to separate them and put them in different rooms, separate from the husbands, they were very forthcoming with information. They wanted no part in the fighting, and they wanted no part in harboring anyone. They would tell us where weapon caches were, like Colonel Brinkley said, possibly a hay bale right outside, or maybe the cemetery right down the road. We found lots of stuff in cemeteries. I think it was just invaluable to have that separation, and the women instantly knew they wanted no part of that, and they were really quick to trust us because they knew we had everyone's best interest at heart. We were just trying to clear out insurgents. Not everybody supported those insurgents.
What struck me about what Colonel Brinkley was saying that I hadn't heard before, because when I originally interviewed him, it was right at the start of our making of the documentary, and he was still very much in the Army, and there were real limitations about what he had to say, what he could say to us. And but what I realize now is, just listening to him, is how necessary, Shannon, Team Lioness really was. I mean, it was almost inevitable, because the Team Lioness work there, like, was just valuable. And that's what I'm hearing from you. Without you guys and just diffusing tension. And so a lot of attention is put on the attachment with the 2-4 Marines and the street fighting. But beyond that, you were really diffusing tensions and helping to stop further fighting by getting intel and helping these women sort of get rid of all this, the arms and bombs and whatnot.
Yeah, we diffused tensions in multiple ways, and not only were we trying to diffuse all that with the local Iraqi people, like Colonel Brinkley spoke on, the Marines most certainly did not want us. They did not want to be responsible for us. They didn't want us attached to their infantry units. And it goes to speak on a lot of things. But so not only were we diffusing tensions with the Iraqi people, we're also diffusing tensions with our Marine counterparts at the same time. And that's really kind of having that's not caught between a rock and a hard space. I don't know what is. I'm definitely glad to see that things have changed now, that the world continued to move forward, because I do feel like we were definitely crucial pieces. We were instruments in helping keep the peacekeeping missions peaceful that weren't always peacekeeping missions.
No, and again, I mean, it's important. A lot of discussion has been around the fighting and the contributions, and your participation in that, and against the Combat Exclusion Policy. But what's really becoming clear is the role you played in diffusing tensions and helping to avert certain conflicts. And I think that's equally important, because in the end, nobody wants to fight. If you can do it without fighting and just diffuse tensions and find resolutions, with the least amount of trauma, well, that's the best outcome. So I think that's just Absolutely. An important, and I think that's a good segue into talking about episode 3, the title Bruise Like a Fist. And this is the 3rd episode. It's written by Taylor Sheridan, and this time it's directed by Anthony Burns. So I have a lot of thoughts about this episode. What did you think, Shannon? Did you enjoy it?
Yeah, I mean, this episode, I feel like they're giving more detail as into what her mission entails and everything she has to go through, and being quick and thinking on the fly. I think that also plays into what we went through. A lot of times there were no rule books, there were no instructions prior to. We had to do a lot of thinking on the fly a lot of times. And then
Right.
Later on, they made sure to go back and fix that recourse, so it would never happen again. But I think this episode was interesting, to say the least.
Right. I was really struck by the fact that, she's driving to, Cruz is driving to Chesapeake Bay, and Joe's on the phone with her, and they're still figuring out, well, what's your identity? And Cruz wants to say she's a student, but clearly that's not going to play out, because if she's an English student, she doesn't, according to when Joe asks her, what books could you talk about? She's not prepared, and she doesn't know enough about art to pull that off. So, and I did like the revelation in the I guess they're back in the Washington restaurant where Zoe Saldana is having, I guess, coffee or lunch with Caitlin, the Nicole Kidman character. And because in that scene, it's basically Caitlin's intuition that drives that scene, because she sees that Joe has some concern, something about maybe something not being quite right. And then we find out that Joe says that Aaliyah has actually more money and more connections, and somehow that's making Joe suspicious about what have they really sent Cruz into. I don't know if anybody else picked up on that, but that was my take, that Nicole Kidman is her relationship with Joe is very intuitive. She's just always probing her.
Right. And I think a couple of those scenes track to real world interactions, Daria, because, if you've noticed, like the last couple episodes, here's Cruz getting thrown into these missions on the fly, last minute, not really knowing exactly what to do, not a ton of preparation, but I'll be damned, in the end, she pulls it off. Well, imagine that. Well, good God, that's a little bit like Lioness now, isn't it?
It is, exactly. I totally see the parallel, and she's thrown into it, and she's rising to the occasion.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that speaks on women's ability to overcome and adapt at any cost. I mean, women are phenomenal creatures.
I'll second that. And I thought it was really funny outside the restaurant when I guess that guy Kyle, the special ops guy, and Joe just looks at him and says, "Hey, I'm late for Soul Cycle. I'm late for my Soul Cycle class," because I feel like that's the one, like, urban kind of my fitness routine, luxury, taking care of myself, that and it's all genders can go to Soul Cycle, but it's just one that I thought, oh wow, they're trying to sort of, like, she's caring for herself in a way, and we haven't seen anything like that before. But I thought it was funny because Soul Cycle symbolizes so much. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts, Shaun?
Well, I'll certainly third that women are phenomenal. Should if I do may say so, my wife especially. But I thought that was interesting that we sort of took a diversion from Cruz's story and had a little bit more time with Zoe's team. That her team was split in half due to that conversation she had outside the restaurant, and they went to do an extraction. And you kind of feel like, why are we seeing this? It was a sort of a big action sequence. They get the target that they're looking for. Are we seeing this simply to see the effectiveness of her team, or are we seeing this because the person that they were extracting is going to take part later? Or are we seeing it because we needed to see how effective Zoe was with a minimalized team? There's some detours in the series that I sort of perk up and say, why are we seeing this right now? What's the purpose of us noticing this? Because they could have just said, hey, you guys are needed, off they go, and we don't see them until they get back from the extraction. We hear it went successfully, but we do get a long sequence of that particular extraction. And is it just because we wanted to add some action into it, to sort of be the opposite of Cruz's very dialogue heavy part in this episode, of her being embedded finally and her developing this relationship, which I will say on the side, her developing relationship with Aaliyah seems forced to me. And I don't know if that feels the same way to both of you. I'm just speaking from like a viewer standpoint, that they sort of met in Kuwait and suddenly they developed this really strong friendship. And now she's hanging out with them and she's being introduced to the whole group. And there was almost like, wouldn't they understand that there's a vetting process? Zoe on their side, the team, they're saying, do they know about us? How are we going to get her in there? Where are we going to place the mics? They're definitely scanning her phone. And there's this whole idea of like, they're trying to figure out if anybody is being embedded with them. But you see Laysla's character Cruz sort of embed with them pretty easily and be a part of this. And I don't know if that feels forced to you as well.
Well, I think you bring up two good points, Shaun, because I too felt that this episode starts to reveal what I saw, not only the sort of just a subplot with the extraction, but then there's the additional subplot with Caitlin at home with her husband, and something's going on there because and so I kind of see those were parallel. They're both they're going to have to feed back into the main plot, to the main story. I mean, I think those things are both being set up, and the whole thing, the plot's thickening, so to speak. But when Caitlin is with her husband, and he says, they're talking about the OPEC and this one, I think it's Kudrow oil, and he says, don't poke the bear. He clearly knows enough about what she's doing, and he's kind of warning her. But I do feel that, it was Cruz and Aaliyah formed a friendship very easily, and I felt like maybe they just wanted to motor past that. Like if they had 10 episodes, maybe they could have spent more time on it, but it does really happen so fast. So I do agree that there is a forced quality to it. It just happens. And I guess, mostly that you just have to say, well, that seems easy, given that the entire operation hinges on them forming some kind of a bond so that Cruz can get in.
Exactly.
And so, if you don't mind, I'd like to speak on what you were just talking about. I think that some of these scenes shows the dynamics of our roles in the military. You may be assigned, to speak on what Colonel Brinkley was speaking on earlier. You may be assigned, like I was assigned as a track mechanic, but that's not where my role started or ended. I had 3 full-time jobs, just like you said. Had to decide what day, what mission I was going to be on. Was I going to be a mechanic? Was I going to be a lioness? Was I going to be a gunner on a support run? I mean, and it just goes to show that, like in Special Ops Lioness, where half of the team ends up going to work a sidebar mission in the middle of Cruz's mission, that's literally how everything goes down. We're pulled into different roles you may or may not be prepared for. And it just goes to show that you can split the team and still be effective. And it even capitalizes more on Joe's role as a leader. And they were all wanting to pull her out. And you just have to have trust and believe in your soldier.
Well, I think, Shannon, your point is very pertinent to the scene. I get exactly what you're saying, because it's really pertinent to the scene where when Cruz is gets into her bathing suit, and then Aaliyah sees her and calls in the doctor, and the team is watching this because everybody's surveilling everybody, but the team is watching this, and ironically, the bruises that the doctor examines were caused by Joe's putting Cruz through the grinder, so to speak, to see what her capacity was before she would break. So it's really Cruz who has to really think, and that's exactly where she was thinking on her feet and comes up with this story about the abusive boyfriend, which ironically is actually true because that's how it all starts out.
Right. Why she probably has emotion and sell it because she actually lived it.
That's right. And so, but I thought it was a pretty amazing scene, and trying to figure out what it all meant at the beach with Cruz and Aaliyah. I guess everyone else from the mansion goes out to dinner, and the two of them are sitting on the beach. And I was wondering how, what interpretation, Shaun or Shannon, you saw in this, because Aaliyah is saying it's funny how these images in our minds, there's no recreating them. They are only for the mind, no matter how hard we try. And I feel like she's saying something about, what you think is going on, or what you wish for, or what you imagine isn't really what's going on, or that's not how the world is going to be. That's not reality. And I feel like that's injecting this idea of what does Aaliyah know and what doesn't she know? Because then at the end, she says, Cruz asks her, if really probably referring to her father, do they choose your friends? And she says, they choose it all. Anyway, that made me feel very like, wow, Cruz is really in a difficult situation.
Absolutely. It's like her whole life's laid out for her by design without any input from her. Eerily familiar.
Right. Because I don't know, that made me wonder about where Aaliyah's, what side is she on? Is she on a side? Does she have a mission? Did you have a feeling about that, Shaun?
I like the character development in that particular scene. We haven't had much real personal time with Aaliyah. So I think that, the friends mentioned earlier, like her taking on Cruz as a reclamation project, she should get a dog instead, but this is a great way for Aaliyah to open up and connect with somebody about her life and what she's experiencing and having choices taken away from her. She even mentions in that scene that, all of the rules of the Middle East, and Shannon, you certainly can speak to seeing the rules that women deal with in the Middle East as opposed to here in America. And I thought it was one of the better scenes so far between Cruz and Aaliyah, certainly, just to kind of get an idea of life experience and history.
Absolutely. I think it was an inclination into her thought process too, and how women's thought processes continue to evolve, and we're seeing more women, just like Colonel Brinkley mentioned, women can serve in any capacity as long as they can pass the same standard test now. I think that speaks on Aaliyah's character and maybe more forward thinking. Like when I was in Iraq, there are so many things. I almost I felt like I was fighting a war, but I also felt like I was fighting for these women secretly, whether they knew it or not, because I would watch every single day how mistreated they are. They spend all day cooking these meals, and they spend all day working the fields. And they cook for all these men, and the women are not allowed to eat with the men. They only get to eat what is left over. I mean, that's what I've seen time and time again. Women cannot walk side by side with their husbands. They have to walk behind them. It's just a way, to me, to bring some more forward thinking into it, because women are treated absolutely horrible over there. And I understand that that's their religion and the way of doing things, and I'm not trying to undo anything. But at the same time, I was also trying to liberate them in some small way at the same time. Sometimes it just takes one thought to change the world.
Wow, Shannon, that's a really I haven't heard you speak so directly to that aspect of your time over there, and you're really making a lot of great points, and I see it, and it really it moves me to hear you say that.
Well, every time we went into a home and we seen a woman crammed into what would be like a coat closet, and that was the place that she was sleeping, while everyone else, it broke my heart. I mean, and I think also speaks to these women being like, oh my gosh, it's okay. We can speak up and we can talk and we can tell these other women things that are happening. I think we also gave them a little bit of courage, if you will, to feel like they had a voice and to feel like they could speak. And whether or not the men agreed with it or didn't agree with it didn't matter, because we had them separated and they were safe and they could finally use their voices. I think that's key.
Right. And I love hearing you say that, because I think, again, it brings up another aspect of the Lioness missions. Again, it's not about the combat. It's about the interpersonal relationships and just being
Absolutely.
there with men, and sort of that pathway, that kind of connection, that relationship, potentially has positive implications for the mission and for just the relations.
So we're going to see where this leads. And there was a sort of aside that one of the friends, a male, tried to sort of come on to Cruz. She quickly dealt with that. It's something that I think character-wise, we just, again, we needed to see that Cruz is capable of taking care of herself. She quickly handled that. But what we also saw in that scene was that he came to her room and tried to barge into her room, but that security at this mansion that she is embedded in intervened and took him and sent him away. And then from this, Aaliyah's husband says, we're gonna go, and they are hopping on a plane, and that's pretty much the end of the episode of where are we going and where's Cruz going, and now Jo needs to get her team together and follow.
That's right. And I just want to say that I think after that scene in the mansion where I don't even know that I remember that character's name, Sam, maybe, who tried to sort of break into Cruz's room, it kind of mirrors or when that little scene where Jo arrives home and her teenage daughter is making out with her boyfriend on the sofa.
Mm-hmm.
And she really does not take that well, and really sort of, if I were that boy, I would have been extremely afraid. No wonder he left the house right away. And then it just, because to me, one of the things that is going to have to be resolved is somehow, because when Jo goes out to talk to her husband, who is busy on a Zoom, some kind of a Zoom call about a surgical operation, and she says, well, what are the rules? And he's like, well, you aren't here. I can't talk to you about the rules. We just make them up because you're not part of it, basically. And so it's a bit of a crushing moment. But that they sneak in there, and just I just like to note the mirroring. But then it all does end up, and at the end of the episode, Cruz is really, now she's on her own, and you do feel that it's going to be a tough situation for her, because she's, we don't really know where she's going.
I think they're doing a great job of leaving us cliffhangers. So if you were to wait till the entire series comes out, and you're going to want to binge, because they're leaving us questions at the end of every episode, and leaving breadcrumbs throughout each episode to give us an idea of, like, where is this going? Where's this relationship headed? how is this going to develop? It speaks to the talent of the writers and the direction of the series, and obviously the talent of the actors involved. That you're I wouldn't say necessarily on the edge of your seat, but certainly I'm being entertained. And I'm enjoying this podcast in particular simply because we're getting so much more in-depth history on all these themes and ideas that are being placed throughout Special Ops Lioness. But I'm excited for our next episode 4 of the podcast, as well as Special Ops Lioness episode 4.
I would say the script is really leaving page turners here for us. So I found the last scene with the plane taking off just kind of like, oh my God, what's going to happen next? So everyone will just have to tune in and we'll discuss it in our next podcast.
I can't wait.
And to our listeners, if you're just finding the Lioness Origin Story podcast here, please check out our first 2 episodes that recap episodes 1 and 2 of Special Ops Lioness. We are now on YouTube, so you can go onto there. You can subscribe to that podcast channel on YouTube and listen there if that's where you would like to. You can you can subscribe. We'd love any interaction. You can email me, Shaun, SHAUN, at veteransbreakfastclub.org with any thoughts or comments that you have about the Lioness history or questions you may have for Daria or Shannon. So thank you so much for listening, and we'll look forward to the next episode.
Absolutely. So thank you, Shaun, and thank you, Shannon.
Thank you, guys. Y'all have a good day. I appreciate it.